Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. It's my pleasure tonight to extend a very warm welcome to you all, colleagues, students, and our broader public community to the inaugural lecture of Professor Urs Daellenbach from the School of Management. For those who don't know me, I think just about everyone here does, but I'll obey the instructions. For those that don't know me, I'm Professor Jane Bryson. I'm the Dean of the Wellington School of Business and Government here at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. I have had the pleasure of working directly with Urs since I first joined the school in 1999, just 1 year after Professor Daellenbach himself joined. He joined us from the Haskayne School of Business at the University of Calgary in Canada, where he had spent 5 years as an associate professor. We have benefited from his passion and expertise ever since. One of our most experienced experts in strategic management and innovation, Professor Daellenbach has served our community in a wide variety of leadership roles, ranging from multiple program director roles to twice acting as Associate Dean Research to Head of School of Management. One of his most significant achievements within the role of Head of School has been the increase in the number of our Māori academic staff and an expansion in focus within the school to include Maturanga and Tikanga Māori. But it could never be said that Urs focuses more on his leadership roles than his teaching. His teaching feedback alone illustrates his ability as a lecturer and tutor, but add to that over 15 doctoral and 20 master's students successfully supervised, and an innovative approach to his classes, including incorporating real-world active business cases on New Zealand firms, and the use of extended simulations. Professor Daellenbach's commitment to his students is undeniable. Beyond his roles here at the university, Urs has been recognised for his record of excellence and research outputs on the international stage many times. He has served on the editorial boards of 3 highly ranked international journals and been guest editor for others. He is a fellow of the International Society for Professional Innovation Management, where he also serves on the International Scientific Panel. He's hosted several international academic conferences, and perhaps most notably, Urs has been recognised a total of 7 times for his excellence in reviewing by the Business Policy and Strategy Division of the Academy of Management, the largest global management academic conference. He's never one to shy from a challenge, despite working in an area of research that typically does not secure much external funding. Professor Daellenbach has been part of teams that have secured over $10 million of external funding during his time here. His current research interests focus on the management of research organisations, value creation and value capture, productivity, and how resources and capabilities are developed and utilised to sustain competitive and cooperative advantage. Most recently, Urs has been co-leading a national team researching both the barriers and enablers that science and engineering researchers face when engaging with the industry, particularly Māori. As government funders seek to expand and leverage the pathway from research to successful commercialisation within New Zealand, this work, as with much of Urs's past work, will have significant implications on both policy and practice. It is this work into open innovation that is the subject of Professor Daellenbach's lecture this evening. The approach has been championed to business practices the world over for the last 2 decades, yet its potential is not often realised. Tonight, Urs explores what true open innovation would involve. He will identify a range of barriers to openness and provide suggestions for how we can overcome these through reflections on his own role and research. Nāku te honore ki te whakātu I ianei ahorangi Urs Daellenbach. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Urs Daellenbach and invite him to the podium.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Talofa lava, malo alele, guten Abend, bonsoir, goeienaand, if Vanessa's here, no, und grüezi. Thank you all for being here, especially since there's quite a select group that has arrived. Thank you, Jane, for those kind words and for being such a wonderful colleague across research and administration. I'd also like to thank a few others before I begin, and in doing so, you'll probably notice a word from the title of my address being repeated. First, I'd like to express my deepest appreciation to my wife, Kate, without whose openness to coming and staying in New Zealand, my research journey would likely have taken a very different path. Unfortunately, she is unable to be with us here today because her father's health deteriorated rapidly last week and she had to quickly fly back to Canada. Michael Coulson was a geography academic at the University of Calgary for about 30 years and passed away at the weekend. He will be greatly missed by his wife Marie, his 4 daughters, 8 grandchildren, and his whānau and friends. So I'd also like to thank Seb, my son, for taking on the mantle of being my family support here today. Second, I'd like to thank Sally Davenport, who, despite me stealing her office in the Murphy building when I first arrived in Wellington, while she was away on RSL, remained open enough to work with me on a range of collaborative research ventures. While I was already interested in innovation as a research context, her connections into the science system here have allowed us to study key aspects, often from the inside. Oh, not what I wanted. Third, to Steve Cummings, who's currently in Europe, another internationally recognised strategy and entrepreneurship colleague here at Herenga, Waka, who exemplifies openness in the breadth of his successful co-authorships. And finally, to Colin Campbell-Hunt, who I wish could have been here. He was an ever-smiling mentor and critical friend whose relocation to Otago 20 years ago unfortunately curtailed a lot of the joint research that we had begun. But more on locational influences later. Let me start with a whakatauki. Whawhia te kete mataranga. This proverb suggests that we should fill our basket of knowledge with diverse types of knowledge and that we should actively look for the possibilities that gives. For when you stop learning, you will stop growing. My talk this evening addresses such knowledge gathering and use, highlighting that there are many hidden barriers to overcome in following the wisdom of this whakatauki. So, on to open innovation, a topic that I've ended up researching over the last 25 years without necessarily setting out to do this. As a well-indoctrinated academic, I'm going to start by giving you a definition. Henry Chesborough, who is typically seen as introducing this concept in his 2003 book, proposed the definition I have here. The emphasis is on purposive inflows and outflows of knowledge as we move from basic research to its application, not just to enhance internal innovation activities, but also considering how knowledge might be best used externally. Chesborough's book examined the failure of Xerox Corporation to commercialise key inventions from its Palo Alto Research Centre. Things such as graphical user interface, the Ethernet, or object-oriented programming, in which they were a leader, in contrast to its success with commercialising laser printing technology, something connected to its core business, whereas those other inventions were only tangentially related. His argument about opening thinking was to contrast this to closed innovation. That is, where an organisation controls and relies on its own knowledge and innovation processes entirely. This characterisation of closed innovation was to a great extent a straw man that he proposed to showcase the novelty and distinctiveness of what he termed as open innovation. Other academics jumped in to critique that definition as being old wine in new bottles, noting that existing studies had already addressed the value of integrating customers or suppliers into innovation activities or having inter-organisational networks and alliances. So that definition did subsequently get elaborated, but it continued to distinguish that a firm will perhaps seek to gain these advantages through either monetary means or not, but at its core it still centres on whether knowledge flows are crossing some sort of organisational boundary. As noted in that definition, open innovation was that contrast to a stylised depiction of closed innovation, represented here in the internal knowledge flows needed to get a product or service to a market, from basic research activities through to development. Most firms, though, have not operated in that way for probably 100 years or more. Okay? Firms pursuing innovation typically recognise that it is useful and that there is useful knowledge and technology outside of their organisation at universities, research institutes, or controlled by their competitors. What has become clearer in the last 30 years is that the bigger problem may be not that you can identify where the valuable knowledge is, but how you actually get it inside your organisation and to use it. Okay? So I'll give you an example from some previous research that I did with a colleague in Calgary. There's something called horizontal drilling. The idea of horizontal drilling was widely known in the industry. There were presentations that had been done across the whole industry. Everyone had access to that knowledge. Horizontal drilling was an alternative to drilling a vertical shaft directly into a reservoir below, and it cost roughly 3 or 4 times as much to do. Despite having equal knowledge, many firms experience very different paths and very different success with using it, with some retreating from those initial attempts and not using it for another 5 or 10 years because of that poor success. What we identified as crucial was that there was a learning orientation taken by the successful firms, and that they also brought a broader mix of skills and knowledge bases in. Okay? The problem was not changing the angle of the drill once you're a kilometre down underground. The problem was actually knowing what that reservoir looked like. If you could hit it accurately, you were able to get a lot of oil out. If you didn't, if you missed and you hit only the top of that thin well, your production was much lower. Okay? Everyone thought that the problem would be turning that corner and hitting it accurately, but you first had to know what you were aiming for. Okay? So that was really illustrating that you needed this mix of knowledge. You had to bring a range of knowledge bases together in order to make that actually occur and to have that success. You needed reservoir engineers, you needed geologists in your team. Many firms just didn't do that. They thought all they needed was the specialist to do the drilling, and that's all. That was good. So overall, open innovation adds that you have a broader range of knowledge flows that will affect your success. These could be outside in, and whether you can integrate that knowledge. These could be inside out. Do you have the right connections to actually leverage that knowledge externally to gain something from it? Xerox didn't. They just tended to let other individuals form new ventures with that. Or are they coupled flows, where the success will depend on continuing co-innovation of the knowledge base? Chesborough also highlighted that the ultimate use of some knowledge may be in new markets, and that a single organisation should not necessarily seek to commercialise all of its knowledge itself. Okay, so there were some interesting new developments there. So on the face of it, given that open innovation wasn't necessarily that new, it's quite interesting to see how quickly its popularity has grown, and that hasn't really waned as some other management fads have. Okay, the top graph there is an engram of books that use the term and how rapidly it's spread since 2003. In that year, there were 200 web links for open innovation. By 2013, there were 480 million. Chesborough's 2003 book alone has over 26,000 citations. Wouldn't we all like to have that? And of his 100,000 plus citations, most relate to open innovation. As a search term, its popularity persists across the entire globe, with particular prevalence in South Korea and Japan, as well as in Europe and Scandinavian countries. Open innovation now has its own journal, a society dedicated to the concept, and a regular conference, as well as continuing focus for special issues. So perhaps the question is, why this level of interest? I'll start with saying that innovation remains essential for our changing world, particularly if we are to mitigate or adapt to today's global challenges. For business, competitive forces regularly erode their current advantages. And these forces can be harder to predict and more difficult to counteract or imitate when they're based on diverse knowledge bases. Okay? While most of us are familiar with incremental innovations in products and services, such as the upgrading of our phones quite regularly, or universities recording lectures pre-pandemic and then making them available, other innovations may be less apparent. Take, for example, the process innovation of airlines selling tickets themselves that has basically wiped out the travel agent industry. Beyond product or process innovation, two other types also exist. Position innovation would be where something like merino wool is used for different clothing layers, facilitated by technology being able to measure that fineness. Okay? Most of us can't tell the difference between a 150 or a 180 or a 200 level garment, but we'll pay for that difference. Okay? Manuka honey becoming a medical product is another example of position innovation. Finally, paradigm innovation would be where an organisation shifts its mental model entirely, such as when Fujifilm moved away from film production to use its knowledge base for skincare and makeup application at the nanoscale. So, yeah, innovation is going to be important. It's clear that we need to innovate, but why open innovation? Well, for me, there are always benefits from accessing external knowledge, not just to eliminate some of the innovation paths that might not be that useful. Openness can also be crucial for efficacy, speed, or responsiveness. All you have to do is look at the pandemic with Oxford AstraZeneca and that collaboration bringing a vaccine to market so much quicker. Lego is another example. Okay? It emerged from close to bankruptcy to now having kit ideas developed by customers who come in and say, can you do this for me? Or it has partnerships with Levi's, which I just found out today, where it's cool to have their Lego buttons on that. We have Star Wars as well. You have them making movies. Again, they're not doing all that themselves, but they're utilising their knowledge base to explore these other options. In New Zealand, we have a relatively strong base for innovating, but we invest less as a percentage of GDP across government and business than other countries. We don't necessarily develop products that will scale well internationally or meet international needs. We also face a real dilemma of pursuing global markets because starting from our small market, that rush to growth may require investments or commitments that rapidly lead firms to fail if it's not successful. And frequently, our entrepreneurs maintain very close control over their product and development and aren't willing to relinquish some of that might be necessary for growth. Innovation's also, and open innovation is also really important for grand challenges or mission-led research. Okay, Seb, you'll see yourself in this photo. It wasn't because you were coming, it's something I picked well beforehand. It's particularly important for these sorts of things like meeting UN Sustainable Development Goals or a mission like getting to Mars and exploring that. The scale, the complexity of those challenges, the urgency with them requires a more open approach. You're going to need a multidisciplinary or perhaps an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary team in order to achieve it. You're going to need collaboration between universities, Crown Research Institutes, industry, Māori in New Zealand in order for it to be truly radical or successful. You want to seek ambitious, novel solutions. You're not going to get that from our ordinary approach to research. You want to connect the social world to the laboratory, to the experimental domain. Okay? So let me illustrate some of these aspects a little bit more, and I'm going to deviate from the typical one-way communication in inaugurals by giving you a situation and asking you to come up with your top-of-mind answer to this. Don't worry, I won't be making judgments of this. And Sally, you're going to have to not participate because you've seen this before. Okay? Consider this dilemma. You have something fragile at the top of a cliff, and you need to get it to the bottom without breaking it. Okay, a real engineering problem here. You need to do it in a matter of days or maybe hours. What might you do? What sort of solutions come to mind?
Airlift it.
Sorry?
Airlift it.
Airlift it? Okay.
Trampoline at the bottom.
Trampoline at the bottom, okay.
Some form of parachute.
Parachute, okay.
Carefully carry it.
Carefully carry it, but you might need to build a path first or something. So all of us will tend to rely on our own experience, our own knowledge base in coming up with these solutions. A pilot might come up with the sort of example that Katie came with. Of someone who works in the freight industry will probably think of, maybe I need to package it right so that it doesn't break. Okay, slow its fall to cushion its impact, the trampoline. Okay, what about a zip line? Could have been another solution. Okay, everyone typically reverts to their core knowledge, and solutions will tend to be incremental variations of that core knowledge rather than something radically new or different. An interdisciplinary team is likely to generate a more radical solution or outcome. So again, yeah, for me, open innovation will be crucial for solving this sort of challenge. Let's look at a different real example. And for this, I'm going to draw on something from the Science for Technological Innovation National Science Challenge. SIFTI, something that I've been part of, something that a few members of the audience here are also part of. Okay. Consider the goal of developing a $3 billion blue economy in New Zealand by 2035, although I think now they've revised that to wanting to do it by 2030. Yeah, we're going to need new technologies. We're going to need buoys. We're going to need sensors. We're going to need underwater drones, perhaps. Okay? That's going to need a range of scientific disciplines. This stuff is going to need to be robust. Every time I've attended a meeting of these scientists, they keep mentioning that oceans eat technology. Okay? So again, you're going to have to involve a range of disciplines in order to get the right solutions to make useful products here. Aquaculture occurs offshore and it's moving further out. So the cost of visiting or checking any of these farms is growing quite a lot. It costs thousands of dollars to take a boat out to a mussel farm just to check whether the warning and signal lights are still working. Okay, so to get to $3 billion, we're also going to need more and better data. But really you want it processed first into information or knowledge before it's sent back on shore, because satellite communication is really expensive. Okay, so again, you're going to want to add new disciplines in there. You're going to want to add artificial intelligence or machine learning. If you don't think of that stuff at the beginning of the project, you get a much smaller solution. The product will take a whole lot longer to get to its commercialisable outcome if it ever gets there. I've got another example of why you might want to have multiple stakeholders in the room. Okay, most scientists have never visited a mussel farm. Okay, so if you can get the scientists out there, they'll learn more about the situation that they're in. Okay, if you look at that drone there, okay, they might not think about the fact that a cable is going to be quite problematic around a whole set of mussels. So if they begin to learn that earlier, they might think about having a remote control drone. For something like SIFTI, that's an even better challenge to pursue. What about the sensors part of it? I was at an industry meeting early on in the project where scientists were brainstorming what sort of sensors they would need to develop. And one of the scientists indicated that he could measure the size of the plankton or the algae that was in the water to a very high degree of accuracy. A few minutes later, a mussel farmer stood up and candidly said, "So that's cool, but what good is it to me? The mussels eat what they eat. I can't change that." The scientist was naturally a bit deflated, but a few minutes later stood up and said, what if I could tell you where the bigger food was that could get filtered out? And immediately there was a response here, I can do something with that, okay, because I can raise or lower the muscle strength. So you can see how the science gets changed when you have these interactions occurring at different parts of the project. There will be a much earlier development of perhaps where the different sizes are, rather than, okay, the average size within this amount of water is this sort of protein or lipid or whatever. So you're going to want those interactions. You're going to want that to speed up the science, moving it from being cool to being cool and practical. But the benefits from involving those multiple disciplines and stakeholders may be quite clear, but why don't we then see more open innovation happening around the world? Okay, well, it could start with just the fact of trying to secure that sort of cooperations, trying to secure that sort of access will cause concerns. Sanford's isn't going to let everyone out to their mussel farms every day, but that might be what's necessary. You're likely going to have a whole lot of previous interactions to build up trust before those industry partners will invest that sort of time and resources. There are other barriers as well. Those complex, multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder teams are actually very difficult and time-consuming to initiate and manage. The formation and management of those teams often goes unfunded in our science system. Okay, something I'm personally experiencing at the moment. I think I spend more time on contracting and chasing invoices than I do sometimes on doing the research. University industry research collaboration in New Zealand does not have a great track record. It might be a little bit better for the research institutes, but even 10 years ago, someone like Industrial Research was searching for ways to build a better connection with the majority of New Zealand businesses that hadn't actually been coming to them for their services, which led to something called the What's Your Problem New Zealand challenge, where they gave away $1 million of R&D. Okay, again, something initiated out of some collaboration out of Victoria University that might not have occurred otherwise. I could say that this is just a New Zealand problem, but it's actually similar overseas, although it does vary. Places like Finland, industry will actively invest in supporting PhD students who will then go through their studies looking at problems that have relevance to those businesses. Another part of this is that university researchers worldwide like their autonomy. Most of us like to choose what we research. Isn't that what you want, though? Motivated researchers, clever people doing what they want. But at that extreme, this could lead to research for research's sake. Key aspects of such thinking are deeply ingrained in our science system and science systems around the world. The Vannevar Bush quote there that I have argues that there is value in separating basic research from practical ends, something that open innovation argues against. He says you can't predict with accuracy what purpose the research might end up influencing. So the researchers are seen to be best placed to determine the crucial areas for their critical endeavour. And research policy in those countries becomes to ensure that there is sufficient basic research funded nationally by the government in order to have the right stockpile of knowledge to support industries to compete internationally. Another issue in this whole system is that the predominant focus for university researchers is publications. The university culture, its incentives and processes limit the value of activities beyond this. You just have to look at how publishing enough research forms the key threshold in our promotion decisions. Few trade-offs against research are possible. A slow shift is sort of occurring to look at citations, maybe reads, maybe downloads. But could you offset publications with consulting or contracting? I'd sort of argue that those would be good things to occur in order to have this cooperation happening between universities and industry. Yet it's not something that's necessarily valued. A few academics do manage to pursue this is a virtuous cycle, but for most, adding these sort of activities is yet another demand on their limited time and attention. Could you imagine how someone would take perhaps a sabbatical or a secondment to go and start a venture, and how they would actually then get back into the university system? That would actually be really hard to do. As a result, there's little researcher effort directed towards anything post-publication. Some of us might write a conversation piece, but many of us won't. Might not even be acceptable to do that for some articles. So we might seek at times to inform our students, but what about connecting to others? Maybe that's an area where we have to do more work. For me, this means that any attempt to open up behaviours has to overcome the inertia associated with traditional metrics and scorecards in universities, and those are very deeply embedded and will be hard to change. A second barrier is sort of that divide between research and industry. We're seen to speak very different languages. Academics are regularly encouraged to alter their communication, to teach to something that reflects the real world of business. That we're not, what we teach isn't reflecting that real world, is the argument. Some argue that understanding the other's language is very important. Otherwise, we end up talking past each other with the same word being interpreted differently by the different parties. Or, if we don't understand these sorts of things, we might forget to observe important tikanga or protocols when our sought-after cooperation involves Māori. Such groups have very different timeframes, goals and principles. For researchers, a 2-year research project seems short. Some of our publication decisions take almost that long. For business, 3 to 6 months is basically what they might tolerate. Yesterday would be really good. Okay? Researchers aim for validation and replication. Business wants something that's workable or better than what they have. Researchers want rigour, impartiality, detachment. Practical relevance things is what businesses seek. Okay? I'm purely pointing out these things as differences, not that either perspective is inherently better. As with research, most businesses struggle to break out of their framing of issues. Again, quoting Vannevar Bush, industry is generally inhibited by preconceived goals, by its own clearly defined standards, by the constant pressure of commercial necessity. If you ask them what our research should consider, it typically involves something quite incremental based on our current situation. Or, if I quote one of our SIFTI researchers, industry pull and science research drive can align if you already know exactly what you're going to do. But that's not going to be very stretchy at all, because if you know what you're doing, that's not actually research, it's development. Okay, meaningful collaboration needs a foundation of trust, and such differences that I've pointed out here will affect that, as does the current low level of interactions between industry and university in New Zealand. It's not because I'm boring him. He's got something else to do. A third barrier relates to IP concerns. Firms have a very strong desire to seek competitive advantage from any investments they make in R&D, even if they are only providing time or access to things, rather than financial or physical resources. Our research has highlighted that IP concerns will frequently be raised early on and can quickly become very contentious. You just have to look at some of the quotes I've got up there. Again, you'll see how small shifts in language will affect perspectives. Okay, industry wants it open to us, or them in particular, versus a researcher probably wants it open to everyone. Open source may be their ideal. The drive for publication that I noted earlier will create another issue within this, another point of conflict, since timely publication impacts when whether something will remain proprietary or not. Okay. I'd also note that such conflicts are equally apparent between industry members. I recently observed a 2-day forum seeking to explore innovation and collaboration possibilities, and for 1.5 days of the 2-day forum, progress was impeded due to the prevailing industry view that investing resource in R&D meant that each firm should exclusively own that IP. Eventually, following a technology demonstration by a scientist and a presentation by a managing director from an engineering company completely outside of the sector, it became apparent to the industry members there that there actually would be projects of common interest and benefit to them, and particularly those that were where the value relative to the cost was actually insufficient for any single business to invest in them alone. Okay, so for me, university science may have a role to play in actually facilitating some of that co-opetition between industry members. Overcoming this sort of IP barrier overall will require having those discussions very early on in the project. I don't think they often do occur early on in the projects, and would involve specifically involving knowledge about potential pathways. One of the things that SIFTI has done is to employ a commercialisation manager, where they come into every project and they say, so have you thought about where this might go? Have you thought about who you might talk to? And then also perhaps involving specialists in terms of managing IP at that point as well. Otherwise, IP is going to sort of remain there in the background as a contentious thing and probably derail some of the cooperation that you might want. So, what else might our research do to overcome some of the barriers to open innovation? I'd say firstly, we'll need to put some incentives and probably even requirements in place for open behaviours. Okay, however, that sort of incentive or requirement in and of itself is unlikely to be sufficient to generate quick change. For me, you just have to look at Vision Mataranga policy and how long it's taken for that to gain a whole lot of traction. VM requirements and research grants have been around for quite a few years now. Often, though, these were simply a section that you completed in the application, a section that wasn't necessarily as fully planned out or elaborated on once the application was successful. Okay? When you undertake this sort of basic research, it's intentionally got uncertainties involved in it. It involves taking risks. It's very costly and difficult to determine the reasons for a project not meeting some of its objectives, including why they might have had less engagement or collaboration than they expected. There are also incentives for researchers to delay reporting certain things, especially when they're not occurring as they proposed, because the funding might be taken away from them. Okay? Thus, science grants generally aren't that actively monitored, and there's good reasons for that, with the monitoring only occurring at critical milestones or after its completion. And when that occurs, there is little that can be done about something that wasn't achieved, like your VM intentions, if they weren't successful. Again, one of the interesting things is our research has highlighted that scientists, researchers are actually quite open to external engagements. Okay? But with the science being their primary focus, those parts of the project tend to be given lower priority and are then less fully developed. SIFTI's approach has been to assign a theme leader to all projects, and that's been very favourably received. Sometimes they just say, oh, it's great to have someone interested in how our research is going. But they are then also able to monitor whether certain things are occurring. They can help mentor them through those steps and to see whether those outcomes are actually being achieved. What has also become clear within SIFTI is that more open engagement will require a different set of skills and capabilities, skills that many researchers often haven't developed, even if they're quite senior. Furthermore, such capacity development is typically not funded as part of the research. I would note here that the university's own Mataranga Māori Research Fund would be an example of trying to address this sort of deficit, where you can get funding to develop those sorts of relationships. Other capacity development activities might also be available, but there is often limited availability of those and they might not fit well with the research timeframe. Funding for something like science leadership course unfortunately doesn't align well with the typical budget lines in a department or at the project level. Overall, what I've tried to highlight for you here, though, is that we shouldn't jump to the conclusion that a lack of openness or open innovation is due to poor intentions or lack of interest by researchers. Within universities, we have paid little attention to our human or relational capacities, and as a result, this has likely impeded the extent to which we see openness or engagement. Okay. So taking a more holistic perspective on this, it also requires us to examine what open actually means and what that entails. Dictionary definition, it's a lack of secrecy, concealment, frankness. If I went to the strategy literature, I'd be getting terms like transparency or inclusivity being mentioned. But if I started on those, I'd probably have to start my inaugural again, so I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to boil it down to 5 more commonplace questions. It comes down to thinking about who. That's more than just a count of who's there, but what sort of parties you're deciding to involve. A medical researcher collaborating with a clinician is a good start, but if they collaborate with the same clinician all the time, it's not really that open. Okay? When? What some of our researchers found out that researchers prefer to collaborate externally at only certain parts of the project. They're sort of happy to do it at the beginning because they can talk about all the things they're going to do. They're probably happy to do it at the end again, but less happy to do it in the middle. In fact, what we found is that they will decrease and narrow their collaborations during that phase. It's quite natural. They want to do the research. They're busy doing the research. But again, you might not get some of the benefits that I pointed out earlier if you don't have that ongoing collaboration. And industry probably isn't going to feel very great about being asked to be part of it initially and then not being part of it again through the middle. So that when might be a really important part. What are you going to collaborate on? Unless researchers are certain about their findings, as I said, they may be less inclined to be open. Even though they'll share some things with some people, sometimes they won't share it at others because they haven't got to that stage of certainty. Where? Another thing that we found that was really important was moving where the collaboration occurred. Okay? Something simple like taking the scientists out to a mussel farm, or even different members of a team going to someone else's lab to see what they do, to see what sort of equipment they had, was really important to the collaboration and the success of that. Okay, so you've got to have some openness there and you want to try those things out. Finally, I've got how. SIFTI has left projects to identify how best to interact with external stakeholders. A range of different approaches have been tried. I would say that some of them have worked better than others, but again, as part of our research, we're still trying to figure out exactly which of those will work. Visual, on-site, face-to-face options seem clearly richer and seem to generate more commitment and reciprocal sharing from those external collaborators. However, such options, again, come at significantly greater cost to the project. So let me just move on in my last few minutes here to some insights and implications. I think what we have to do is recognise the costs associated with being open. It's not easy being a big research team that's expected to be open. I think we also have to make sure that there are criteria and incentives for that openness, and then figure out how to monitor those in an effective way within universities. We should try and seek meaningful collaboration opportunities with our stakeholders. Okay, so what else have we got here? The last 2 points here, I think we should really consider openness to be a team phenomenon, okay, versus an individual outcome. One of the things that we tend to do is to say, okay, that's a useful thing for an individual to have, and we make sure that everyone should get that. Okay, but a research team actually provides a range of different options. Does everyone in the research team have to have every capability, have to do everything in the project? Maybe you could actually facilitate and remove some of the work that's involved by having different people specialise on that. Doesn't make them a lesser member of the team, but it actually could make the team function better and for this external collaboration to work better. Lastly, I'd say that too many of our activities are currently not funded in the system or not counted as a cost by the system. All you have to do is look at the number of research applications that are unsuccessful. That's over 90% of Marsden grants. The effort that goes in on a yearly basis to putting those applications in is huge. Why do we make them so big? From a university perspective, I'd say, why do we make our promotion applications so big? Okay, without such changes as a whole, growing openness and innovation is going to remain a hope without a clear supporting strategy or practices. So I'm going to leave you then with just a few takeaways. While many would argue that human beings are inherently social creatures, most of us are social on our own terms. Each individual will respond based on personal factors as well as contextual ones. I'm actually a really good example. I have quite a few research collaborations, so you might see me as open. My school managers, one who's represented here, seem to think that I love making speeches. I don't, but I will when the context or the role requires it. My daughter, not here, complains about how quiet I am, but put me on a volleyball court and I'm actually a different person. Okay? If you see me at an event, you'll often find me at the outer edge. That may probably be by choice. I'm a bit happier there, okay? So one's openness to external collaboration is probably similar to one's willingness to communicate in a second language. Sometimes you will, sometimes you won't. One of the research projects that I was hoping to complete on my leave was actually looking at this analogy. Second language theory is quite developed and has established models on this. At the top layer, you have that desired behaviour. The layers below combine to shape whether that behaviour is likely to occur. In the right social setting, where an individual feels safe, they may be willing to try out their pepeha. That same person, even an hour or a day later, may be unwilling to do this if the attitudes or the climate seems to be different. Some circumstances will mean that their need to feel in control will dominate any desire that they may have for affiliation. Okay? If it's that complex just for communicating in a second language, why should we expect that our willingness and openness to collaborate would be any less complex? A second takeaway would be to seek and to take those opportunities to build our capabilities. It's something that I've done in the last few years. As a researcher, so much of our focus is on technical excellence, but we need these other capabilities. A key question is when to build those capabilities, particularly relative to the opportunities to use them. If you build them and then don't use them, they probably fall out of mind. Another question will be, who is best placed to assess those capabilities, what you need to develop? In SIFTI, we've tried doing this during the projects and getting the person to self-assess what they need, and there's been quite varied uptake and success. My last piece of advice here is something that I've tried to follow more actively in recent years. The university regularly runs training on unconscious bias. I think that they're openly available to everyone, but I'm not sure. Our desire to remain in control may well be one of these biases. However, an openness to research opportunities has led me into some quite different directions, beyond the collaborations that I've had with my strategy and innovation colleagues. These include a study on remote work with Rebecca Downs, to understanding capability assessment as part of a master's supervision with Noel Donnelly, as well as something called the Dark Triad Managerial Characteristics with Jared Howe at AUT. I haven't regretted diversifying my research to these at all, and generally they have ended up informing other research or activities of mine in ways I didn't anticipate, which would have made Vannevar Bush quite happy. A remaining question for me following all of this research is the extent to which open innovation or open activities once learned will stick for our university researchers. There are such strong norms and institutional pressures that drive decisions in ways that are not always open, not always relational or connected. How can we overcome these? Unless openness is a core value for us as individuals, as well as for our organisations and institutions, I think this will remain sporadic. So I think I'll conclude here. Given my focus on openness and open innovation, it seems strange to me that I will not take questions because that's what the process is. But I'm happy to discuss this and other aspects with you later this evening or at any other time. Kia ora, thank you, ngā nui, kia koe. Something that I have learnt in the last few years is that finishing with a waiata could be appropriate, but you really don't want to hear me sing. That's also one of those instances where my openness typically retreats. Instead, here is an eminent professor from the University of Exeter with a song composed for Henry Chesborough's retirement.
We've been innovating now for quite a long time. It's the big thing that's helped us to survive. Find new ways to do things, keep on learning down the line. It's what keeps you and me and companies alive. We've learned how we can manage it, how to repeat the trick, all about the structures and the routines. But that world still keeps on changing, so we need to change with it. Innovate our model, look through a new lens. Open innovation.
Thank you.
Kia ora tātou. My name is Todd Bridgman. For those of you who don't know me, I am acting head of the School of Management for 12 months. So my learned colleague has the opportunity, as he mentioned, to take his research and study leave and progress these important ideas. And my role here is to provide a vote of thanks. I will keep it brief. I know that I stand between you and the refreshments in the foyer, but I did want to take a few minutes just to recognise the contribution that Urs has made to the School of Management, the faculty, and also the university. And I echo everything that Jane said in her introductory remarks. You have certainly demonstrated excellence in your research, the very well-cited papers earlier on in the career, your career of the resource-based view of the firm and strategic management, folding, I guess, nicely into this open innovation. I'd left the gap in my notes to try and make sense of your speech as you gave it. Slightly risky strategy in inaugurals where it all seems very prepared, but I looked at your slides and I didn't really get a sense of it. But now, listening to it, I think I've got a better understanding of what you've been doing for the past 16 years that we have been colleagues in the School of Management. And in some ways, I was sitting there thinking, I'm probably the worst person to be giving this vote of thanks because I did my PhD on commercialisation and the relationships that academics have outside the university. But I was the arch critic of those. So my interest was in academic freedom and academic autonomy, and what I think is the very privileged but valuable role that universities play in society as relatively independent of external stakeholders and therefore not swayed by their influence in the commercial imperative. And so, you know, on the one hand, I think we stand in opposition there, but as I was listening, thinking about it, I was thinking we share something in common, and while it is a very modern take on the university as an institution, I also think it reflects what I've always understood as the essence of the university and what makes the university, this one, but all universities, I think, really precious institutions, and that is the diversity of perspectives or the knowledge types or or whatever you want to see it as, whether that comes from inside the walls of the ivory tower or through engagement with people outside, is that the openness of us as academics, of our students, of other staff, of people who we engage with, to a diversity of perspectives, to be what I would call, and what I teach my students, kind of critically reflexive, that we are open to our own worldviews being challenged by others and learning through engagement with others. And that's always been very special for me for the university. I think it's really exemplified in the work that you've done, so that's terrific. You've demonstrated excellence in teaching, as Jane said, particularly with your work on simulations that bring our students, or give our students as close as possible the experience of running businesses and making decisions and seeing the impact of those decisions while still in the classroom. And I certainly think that you've demonstrated excellence in leadership, and that is something that I just wanted to say a bit about. As some of you will know, I have an interest in leadership. I teach a course on our EMBA called Leading Change. I'm really interested in what we in society, I guess, understands good leadership to be, or strong leadership. I'm interested in how those understandings of what constitutes good leadership has changed over time, and I'm interested in how we teach leadership to our students here in the business school. I think, in my view, a dominant understanding of leadership for the past 30 years has been this idea of the transformational leader, the person with charisma, with great oratory skills, with grand visions for transforming organisations that they're part of, real risk takers. And that can certainly have great benefit for organisations, but coming as I do from a critical management perspective, I've always been fascinated by the dark side of that particular conception of leadership, where we have often, I think, aspirational individuals come into organisations, sometimes seeing their stay in the organisation as a stepping stone towards their leadership portfolio. And because I think the vision of the transformational leader has been dominant, that encourages individuals to come in with their grand visions, whether they know much about the organisation or not, seek to implement them, but to very quickly move on to their next organisation, using that status of having transformed the previous one to get them the next job, without really, I think, hanging around to see if those transformations have benefited the organisation or not. And I think your style of leadership has been very different to that. You've been here at Herenga Waka for 23 years. You understand, is it more? 25? Okay, my maths is bad. I'm not a quantitative researcher. Yeah, 23 or 25. You understand better than most of us here, I think, about this place, about the history of this place, about what makes this place special, about ideas that we've tried in the past, and a real, I guess, care for this place. And I think that's something to be really acknowledged. I've said it before, I'll say it again. You have an encyclopedic knowledge of the institution. If I ever needed to know what to do in relation to the massive bureaucracy that the organisation is, I always came to you first and pretty much always got the answer. And I think that institutional knowledge is really valuable. I would also say your style of leadership is selfless. Okay? And I think that is evidenced through a number of activities, some of which Jane has mentioned. The numerous reviewing awards that you have received, I think, absolutely evidence of the willingness to put your time into the scholarship of others. And I know, having been a journal editor, how hard it is to get people to review papers and conference papers. And the people that put genuine effort into developing the scholarship of others is often unacknowledged or under-acknowledged, and a really vital part of what we do. I think it's been evidenced, your selfless leadership in the management of the science project, what you said before about spending a lot of your time contracting and invoicing. So that is the part of the administrative task, I think, in in terms of bringing these different people together and enable them to get together and share perspectives and generate these open innovation and different ideas. And I also have seen it in your role as head of school, which you will be coming back to at the end of your RSL, your genuine interest in other staff, care for the school, care for the business school and the university, but also willing, I think, to speak on behalf of the school and maybe stand and fight on behalf of the school in certain situations has been very much valued. So it is, in my view, not necessarily transformational leadership or what we often regard as strong leadership today, but I would say genuine academic leadership in both research, teaching and service that really needs to be recognised and encouraged, and therefore I'm delighted that we've been here tonight to celebrate your promotion to the rank of Professor. Thank you.